Mariana Cardoso dos Santos never imagined her life would end this way. Born in São Paulo, Brazil, in 1991, she grew up in the Capão Redondo neighborhood, one of the city's most challenging areas. Her childhood was marked by violence, poverty, and the constant struggle for survival that defined the lives of millions in Brazil's urban peripheries. Her mother worked as a cleaning lady in wealthy homes across the city, while her father disappeared when Mariana was only 5 years old, leaving behind nothing but debts and broken promises. Despite the hardships, Mariana possessed something rare, an exceptional intelligence combined with striking beauty. Teachers noticed her potential early on. She excelled in mathematics and languages, teaching herself English by watching American movies with subtitles and practicing pronunciation alone in her small bedroom. By the time she turned 17, she spoke Portuguese, English, and had begun learning Spanish. Her dream was simple, yet seemingly impossible: escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped her family for generations. After finishing high school, university remained financially out of reach. Instead, Mariana worked multiple jobs simultaneously. She sold cosmetics door to door during mornings, worked reception at a local gym in the afternoons, and spent evenings waitressing at a restaurant in Vila Madalena, a bohemian neighborhood frequented by artists, tourists, and wealthy Brazilians. It was there, among the colorful street art and trendy bars, that her life would take its first major turn. The restaurant attracted an international crowd. Foreign businessmen, expatriates, and travelers filled the tables nightly. Mariana learned quickly how to navigate different cultures, how to charm customers into leaving generous tips, and how to use her intelligence to engage in conversations that went beyond simple service. She understood that in a world structured by inequality, beauty and wit could be leveraged as survival tools. It wasn't manipulation in her mind, it was adaptation. In early 2013, she met Thomas Mitchell, an American contractor working on infrastructure projects throughout South America. Thomas was 42 years old, recently divorced, and lonely in a foreign country where he barely spoke the language. Mariana was 22, ambitious, and acutely aware that this man represented a potential gateway to the life she desperately wanted. Their relationship began casually: dinners after her shifts, walks through Ibirapuera Park, weekend trips to the coast. Thomas was captivated by her energy, her laughter, and the way she made him feel young again. For Mariana, Thomas represented opportunity. Within 6 months, they were married in a small civil ceremony at the Cartório in São Paulo. Mariana's mother cried during the brief proceedings, unsure whether to feel joy or concern about her daughter marrying a man twice her age whom she barely knew. 3 weeks later, Mariana landed at Miami International Airport with a spousal visa, 2 suitcases containing everything she owned, and a heart filled with equal parts hope and calculation. The first year in the United States was an adjustment. Thomas worked long hours managing construction sites across Florida, often traveling for weeks at a time. Mariana stayed in their modest apartment in Coral Springs, teaching herself to navigate American culture through television, grocery stores, and interactions with neighbors. She enrolled in community college, taking business administration courses and improving her English until no trace of an accent remained. She was determined to integrate completely, to become indistinguishable from native-born Americans. But the marriage wasn't built on love, and both parties knew it, even if neither spoke the truth aloud. Thomas wanted companionship and someone to come home to. Mariana wanted stability and a path towards citizenship. The arrangement worked until it didn't. Thomas began drinking more heavily, his temper emerging during arguments about money, but Mariana's desire to work outside the home, about the fundamental emptiness at the core of their relationship. He became controlling, monitoring her phone calls, questioning her whereabouts, and gradually isolating her from the few Brazilian friends she had made in South Florida. The violence started small, a shove during an argument, a grip on her arm that left bruises, words designed to diminish her worth, to remind her that she was dependent on him for everything, her legal status, her housing, her survival in this foreign country. Mariana absorbed it all, calculating her options. She couldn't simply leave. Her immigration status was tied to the marriage. Divorce meant potential deportation back to Brazil, back to the poverty she had fought so hard to escape. Instead, she began planning. She documented the abuse through photographs of bruises, recorded arguments on her phone, and kept detailed journals. She consulted with immigration attorneys about her options, learning about the Violence Against Women Act provisions that could provide a pathway to residency independent of her abuser. But more importantly, she started building a life outside Thomas's control. She found work at a Brazilian-owned real estate agency in Fort Lauderdale, initially as a receptionist but quickly moving into sales. Her language skills, cultural fluency in both Brazilian and American contexts, and natural charisma made her excellent at connecting international buyers with properties. The money provided independence. For the first time since arriving in the United States, Mariana had her own bank account, her own income, her own power. It was through the real estate business that she met the people who would ultimately lead to her downfall. Some clients weren't interested in legitimate property investments. They needed ways to move money, to establish legal residency through property ownership, to create the appearance of legitimate business while conducting operations that existed in legal gray areas. Mariana didn't ask too many questions. She facilitated transactions, connected people, and collected commissions that far exceeded what she made on standard sales. By 2015, she had filed for divorce from Thomas. The proceedings were bitter and drawn out. Thomas contested everything, hired an expensive attorney, and attempted to have her deported by claiming the marriage was fraudulent from the beginning. But Mariana had prepared well. Her documentation of abuse, combined with her established employment and community ties, allowed her to obtain a U visa reserved for crime victims. The divorce finalized in early 2016. Thomas was ordered to stay away from her. She was finally free, or so she thought. The freedom Mariana gained from her divorce was intoxicating but short-lived. The legal fees had drained her savings, and the real estate market in South Florida had become increasingly competitive. She needed money, not just to survive, but to thrive, to prove to herself that she had truly escaped the limitations of her past. The legitimate commissions weren't enough anymore. She needed something more substantial, more lucrative. Her deeper involvement in questionable transactions began gradually. A client asked if she could help establish shell companies to hold properties. Another needed assistance opening bank accounts using foreign documentation. Each request pushed her slightly further into illegality, but the money was exceptional. Within months, Mariana was earning more than she had ever imagined possible. She moved into a luxury apartment in Brickell, drove a leased BMW, and wore designer clothes that transformed her appearance completely. But the lifestyle came with risks she hadn't fully anticipated. In late 2016, federal investigators began examining a money laundering network operating throughout South Florida. The operation involved Brazilian nationals funneling drug proceeds through real estate purchases, exactly the type of transactions Mariana had been facilitating. She didn't know the full extent of what she was involved in until FBI agents appeared at her apartment one morning with a search warrant. The evidence against her was substantial. Bank records showed hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through accounts she controlled. Emails detailed her coordination of property purchases using funds from suspicious sources. Several of her clients had already been arrested and were cooperating with prosecutors. providing testimony that directly implicated her. The lead investigator, Special Agent Diana Reeves, laid out the situation with brutal clarity. Mariana was facing 20 years in federal prison unless she cooperated. The choice seemed obvious. Mariana agreed to provide information about the network's operations, identifying key players and explaining how the money laundering scheme functioned. Her cooperation was valuable enough that prosecutors offered a deal: 5 years of probation with 2 years of house arrest, followed by 3 years of supervised release. She would avoid prison entirely if she complied with all conditions. The alternative was a trial she would almost certainly lose and decades behind bars. In March 2017, Mariana pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering. The judge accepted the plea agreement, but made clear during sentencing that any violation of probation terms would result in immediate incarceration. She was fitted with an electronic monitoring ankle bracelet that would track her location constantly. She was restricted to her apartment except for approved activities: work, medical appointments, court-mandated counseling sessions, and weekly check-ins with her probation officer. The ankle monitor became a symbol of her trapped existence. She was legally free, but practically imprisoned, unable to leave her residence without authorization, unable to travel, unable to live anything resembling a normal life. The real estate career was finished. No firm would employ someone convicted of money laundering. She survived on savings that dwindled rapidly and took on freelance translation work that barely covered rent and basic expenses. Isolation bred resentment. Mariana spent hours alone scrolling through social media, watching other people live the life she had briefly tasted. But more than anything, she thought about Thomas. In her mind, he had become the architect of all her suffering. If he hadn't been abusive, if he hadn't tried to have her deported, if he hadn't forced her into desperate situations, she would never have made the choices that led to her conviction. The logic was flawed, but grief and anger rarely follow rational paths. She began monitoring Thomas obsessively through social media and public records. He had moved to Orlando, remarried a woman named Patricia, and was working for a different construction company. His life had continued forward while hers had collapsed. The injustice of it consumed her. He had beaten her, controlled her, tried to destroy her immigration status, yet faced no consequences while she wore an ankle monitor and lived in a cage. During one of her mandatory therapy sessions, the counselor noted her fixation on her ex-husband. The therapist warned that dwelling on past trauma without processing it healthily could lead to dangerous thought patterns. Mariana nodded, said what she needed to say to satisfy the requirement, but internally, she was already planning. She didn't know exactly what form her revenge would take, but she knew with absolute certainty that Thomas Mitchell would pay for what he had done to her. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Her probation officer approved a request to travel to Orlando for a job interview at a Brazilian import company. It was a legitimate opportunity, but Mariana saw it as something else entirely. A chance to get close to Thomas, to finally settle the debt she believed he owed her. The job interview in Orlando was scheduled for June 15, 2018. Mariana received authorization from her probation officer for a 48-hour window, enough time to drive from Miami, attend the interview, and return. The ankle monitor would track her movements, but as long as she stayed within the approved geographic radius and returned on time, there would be no issues. She had no intention of actually taking the job if offered. The interview was merely a pretext, a legal justification for what she really planned to accomplish. Before leaving Miami, Mariana spent weeks researching Thomas's current life. She discovered he lived in a subdivision called Meadow Creek, a middle-class development on Orlando's east side. His wife Patricia worked as a dental hygienist and left for work each morning at 7:30. Thomas himself had a predictable routine. He departed for construction sites around 6:15 each weekday, returning home between 5 and 6 in the evening. They had no children, no dogs, no complications that would interfere with what Mariana was planning. She also learned something else through public record searches. Thomas had been arrested twice since their divorce for driving under the influence. The second arrest resulted in a suspended license and mandatory alcohol counseling. He was still drinking, still out of control, still the same violent man she had escaped. This knowledge didn't deter her, it justified what was coming. He hadn't changed, hadn't learned, hadn't suffered consequences proportional to the damage he had caused. Mariana drove to Orlando on June 14th, checking into a budget motel near the airport, well within her authorized zone. The interview was genuine and went reasonably well, though she performed with calculated mediocrity, appearing interested enough to seem legitimate, but not so impressive that they would immediately offer her the position. Afterward, she had 24 hours before she needed to begin the drive back to Miami. She spent that time conducting surveillance. She located Thomas's house, a modest, single-story structure with beige siding and a two-car garage. She watched from her rental car parked 3 blocks away as he came home from work, noting that he stopped at a liquor store first, emerging with a brown bag that undoubtedly contained his evening vodka. Patricia arrived shortly after, and both cars disappeared into the garage. Lights came on throughout the house. From the outside, it looked like any other unremarkable suburban evening. But Mariana knew better. She knew what happened behind those walls when Thomas drank, the anger that emerged, the cruelty that he was capable of inflicting. She wondered if Patricia experienced the same abuse, or if Thomas had somehow reformed his behavior with his new wife. Either way, Mariana told herself, what she was about to do wasn't just revenge. It was justice, accountability that the legal system had failed to deliver. That night, she purchased supplies at a 24-hour Walmart: rope, duct tape, a utility knife with replacement blades, garbage bags, cleaning supplies, and a prepaid cell phone. She paid cash, kept her head down to avoid security cameras, and returned to the motel. Sleep didn't come. She lay in bed watching the ceiling, feeling her heartbeat accelerate as the plan crystallized in her mind. There was still time to abandon it, to drive back to Miami and resume her restricted existence. But the anger that had accumulated over months of isolation and resentment had become a living thing inside her, demanding release. The following evening, June 15th, Mariana waited until Patricia left for her evening shift at the dental office, where she occasionally worked late hours. Thomas would be alone, probably already drunk by 8 o'clock when Mariana approached the house. She wore dark clothing, gloves, and a baseball cap pulled low. The ankle monitor continued transmitting her location, but she was still within the authorized Orlando zone. Technically, she wasn't violating any terms of her house arrest. She knocked on the door. When Thomas opened it, his face registered confusion, then recognition, then something like fear. Before he could speak, Mariana pushed past him into the house. The smell of alcohol was overwhelming. His eyes were already glassy, his movements slightly uncoordinated. He was exactly as she remembered: weak, pathetic, dangerous only to those smaller and more vulnerable. What happened next would later be described in clinical detail during court proceedings. Mariana used the element of surprise and Thomas's intoxicated state to overpower him. The rope secured him to a kitchen chair. The duct tape silenced his protests. And then, with a coldness that surprised even herself, she explained exactly why she was there and what price he would pay for the years of abuse, for trying to destroy her life, for escaping consequences while she suffered. The act itself was brutal and deliberate. Using the utility knife, Mariana mutilated Thomas in the most intimate and symbolic way possible. She wanted him to carry permanent physical evidence of what he had done to her psychologically. The violence was shocking in its precision, designed not to kill, but to permanently mark, to ensure that every day for the rest of his life, Thomas Mitchell would remember Mariana Cardoso and understand that actions have inescapable consequences. When it was finished, she called 911 herself, calmly reporting that there had been an incident and that emergency services were needed. Then she sat on the couch and waited for the police to arrive, her hands still covered in blood, the knife resting on the coffee table beside her. Orlando Police Department officers arrived at the Meadow Creek residence at 8:47 p.m. They found a scene that would haunt even veteran investigators. Thomas Mitchell was conscious but in severe shock, still bound to the kitchen chair, hemorrhaging badly. Mariana sat motionless on the couch, her expression blank, offering no resistance when officers ordered her to the ground and placed her in handcuffs. The utility knife, evidence bags would later confirm, contained both Thomas's blood and tissue. Paramedics rushed Thomas to Orlando Regional Medical Center, where surgeons worked through the night, attempting to repair the catastrophic damage. The injuries were survivable, but life-altering. Doctors would later testify that the mutilation had been executed with disturbing anatomical knowledge, severing specific structures while avoiding major arteries that would have caused fatal blood loss. Whoever did this, the lead surgeon noted, wanted the victim to live with the consequences. Detective Raymond Foster, a 23-year veteran of the Orlando PD, took lead on the investigation. When he first interviewed Mariana at the police station, she waived her right to an attorney and confessed immediately. She described the abuse she had endured during her marriage to Thomas, the ways he had controlled and terrorized her, and her belief that the justice system had failed to hold him accountable. She showed no remorse, no emotion whatsoever. Foster had interviewed hundreds of violent offenders during his career, but Mariana's cold rationality disturbed him in ways that emotional perpetrators never had. The case attracted immediate national media attention. Headlines screamed variations of the same narrative. Brazilian woman on house arrest, mutilates ex-husband in revenge attack. Cable news programs debated whether this was a case of extreme domestic violence response or premeditated torture. Feminist groups were divided, some arguing that Mariana represented the ultimate failure of systems meant to protect abuse victims, while others condemned her actions as indefensible regardless of provocation. Patricia Mitchell, Thomas's current wife, gave a tearful interview to local news stations. She described her husband as a changed man who had overcome his drinking problem and worked hard to be a better person. She claimed to know nothing about his abusive history with Mariana and characterized the attack as unprovoked and monstrous. The interview humanized Thomas in ways that complicated public perception of the case. Prosecutors charged Mariana with aggravated battery, with intent to disfigure, kidnapping, and violating the terms of her probation. Combined, the charges carried a potential sentence of 30 years to life in prison. Her public defender, an overworked attorney named Michael Ruiz, immediately recognized the complexity of the situation. His client had committed an undeniably brutal crime, but the context of sustained domestic abuse created potential mitigating factors that a jury might consider. The preliminary hearing occurred 3 weeks after the attack. Thomas appeared via video link from a rehabilitation facility, his testimony halting and obviously painful. He acknowledged that his marriage to Mariana had been troubled and admitted to the DUI arrests that followed their divorce. However, he vehemently denied ever physically abusing her, characterizing her allegations as fabrications designed to justify her criminal behavior. Without corroborating witnesses or medical records from the time of the alleged abuse, his denial carried weight. Mariana's defense team faced a strategic dilemma. They could pursue a temporary insanity defense, arguing that years of trauma had caused a psychological break. Alternatively, they could acknowledge the crime while emphasizing the abuse history, hoping for jury sympathy that might result in reduced charges. Mariana herself complicated these strategies by refusing to express remorse or claim mental illness. She insisted repeatedly that she had been fully aware of her actions and believed Thomas deserved what happened to him. Judge Caroline Hendricks, assigned to the case, was known for her strict interpretation of law and limited patience for emotional appeals. During pretrial motions, she ruled that while evidence of past abuse could be admitted, it would not constitute legal justification for the assault. The message was clear. Whatever Thomas had done years ago, Mariana's response was criminal and would be treated as such. The trial was scheduled for November 2018, giving both sides 5 months to prepare. During that time, Mariana remained in Orange County Jail, held without bail due to flight risk and probation violation. Her ankle monitor, ironically, provided prosecutors with a complete electronic record of her movements, confirming that she had driven to Thomas's neighborhood and remained there during the exact time frame of the attack. The technology meant to ensure her compliance with house arrest had instead created an unimpeachable timeline of her premeditated crime. In jail, Mariana received hundreds of letters. Some expressed support, sharing stories of abuse and applauding her courage to fight back. Others condemned her as a monster who had committed an act of sadistic violence that no prior trauma could excuse. She read them all with the same detached interest she brought to everything now, as if observing her own life from a great distance. The trial began on November 12, 2018, in Orange County Circuit Court. The prosecution team, led by Assistant State Attorney Rebecca Thornton, presented their case with clinical precision. They called paramedics who described the horrific scene they encountered, surgeons who detailed the extent of Thomas's injuries, and forensic experts who confirmed Mariana's DNA on the weapon and throughout the crime scene. The physical evidence was overwhelming and undisputed. Thornton's strategy focused on premeditation. She presented the Walmart receipt showing Mariana's purchase of rope, tape, and the knife hours before the attack. She displayed the probation authorization documents, arguing that Mariana had manipulated the system to gain access to her victim. Phone records showed she had researched Thomas's address and daily routine in the weeks prior. This wasn't a sudden emotional break, Thornton argued. It was calculated revenge carried out with sadistic precision. Thomas testified on the 4th day of trial. He appeared diminished, speaking quietly about the permanent physical and psychological damage he had suffered. He described waking up in the hospital, learning what had been done to him, and the ongoing trauma of living with irreversible mutilation. His testimony was devastating in its vulnerability. Patricia sat in the front row, crying openly, reinforcing the image of a family destroyed by violence. When Thornton asked about the abuse allegations, Thomas maintained his denials. He admitted to being a difficult husband, to drinking too much, and to arguments during the marriage. But he categorically rejected claims of physical violence, suggesting that Mariana had manufactured these stories to justify her crime and manipulate public sympathy. Without contemporaneous police reports or medical records, the defense struggled to counter his version of events. Michael Ruiz faced an uphill battle when presenting Mariana's defense. He called an expert in domestic violence psychology who explained the long-term effects of sustained abuse, including post-traumatic stress disorder, and the ways trauma can influence behavior years after the abusive relationship ends. The expert testified that many victims never report abuse due to fear, shame, or immigration concerns, which could explain the lack of documentation in Mariana's case. The defense also highlighted Thomas's criminal record, the 2 DUI arrests, evidence of continued alcohol abuse and anger management issues documented through court-ordered counseling. Ruiz argued these established a pattern of poor impulse control and aggressive behavior consistent with Mariana's abuse allegations. He presented character witnesses who testified to observing Thomas's volatile temper during the marriage, though none had directly witnessed physical violence. Mariana herself took the stand on day 7. Against her attorney's advice, she insisted on testifying. She spoke clearly and without emotion, describing years of abuse in painful detail, being shoved against walls, grabbed by the throat, slapped across the face when Thomas had been drinking. She explained how he had threatened to have her deported if she reported him, leveraging her immigration vulnerability to ensure her silence and compliance. Then she described the isolation of house arrest, the way it triggered memories of being controlled and trapped during her marriage. She explained that watching Thomas live freely while she remained confined had created an unbearable psychological pressure. She didn't claim temporary insanity or loss of control. Instead, she stated plainly that she had chosen to make him experience permanent consequences for his actions, the way she was experiencing permanent consequences for her own crimes. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. Thornton forced Mariana to acknowledge that her money laundering conviction had nothing to do with Thomas, that her choices had led to house arrest, and that she could have pursued legal remedies like civil lawsuits or reporting past abuse to authorities. She made Mariana admit that she had purchased the knife specifically for the attack, that she had planned every detail, and that she felt no regret for mutilating another human being. Closing arguments occurred on November 20th. Thornton characterized Mariana as a calculating predator who used claims of victimhood to justify torture. She reminded jurors that vigilante justice was not justice at all, and that sympathizing with past suffering couldn't excuse present-day mutilation. The law existed precisely to prevent people from taking revenge into their own hands, regardless of their grievances. Ruiz made an impassioned plea for understanding the context of trauma. He didn't ask for acquittal, but for recognition that Mariana's actions, while criminal, emerged from years of suffering that the system had failed to address. He argued for the minimum sentence, emphasizing that she had already lost everything and would spend years, possibly decades, in prison, regardless of the verdict. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Mariana showed no reaction as the forewoman read the decision. Judge Hendricks scheduled sentencing for December 15th, allowing time for pre-sentence investigation reports and victim impact statements. The sentencing hearing on December 15, 2018, drew significant media attention. Courtroom 4A was packed with journalists, domestic violence advocates, and members of the public who had followed the case obsessively. Security was heightened due to threats both against and in support of Mariana, reflecting the deeply polarized public response to her crime. Judge Hendricks began by allowing victim impact statements. Patricia Mitchell spoke first, her voice breaking as she described the devastation wrought on their lives. She talked about her husband's ongoing medical treatments, the psychological trauma he endured daily, and the way a single act of violence had destroyed their sense of safety and normalcy. She called Mariana a monster who deserved the maximum possible sentence. Thomas himself submitted a written statement, read aloud by the prosecutor. In it, he described the physical pain that remained constant, the medications he would require for life, and the profound humiliation of his permanent disfigurement. He wrote that he forgave Mariana, not for her sake, but for his own peace of mind, but insisted she must face full accountability for what she had done. The statement was powerful, positioning him as a gracious victim seeking justice rather than revenge. Mariana's mother had flown from São Paulo, spending money she didn't have to attend the sentencing. Through a translator, she pleaded for mercy, describing her daughter's difficult childhood, her dreams of a better life, and the ways that immigration vulnerability and abuse had shaped her desperate choices. She sobbed openly, begging the judge to consider that Mariana had already lost everything and that excessive punishment would serve no purpose beyond cruelty. When given the opportunity to make a final statement, Mariana stood and faced the judge directly. She didn't apologize. Instead, she spoke about systems that fail to protect vulnerable immigrant women, about abuse that goes unreported because victims fear deportation, and about the inadequacy of legal remedies when power imbalances are so extreme. She acknowledged that what she did was criminal, but maintained that Thomas had escaped accountability for years of violence, while she had been punished at every turn. Judge Hendricks listened impassively, then delivered her ruling. She acknowledged the complexity of the case and the legitimate concerns about domestic violence and immigration vulnerability. However, she stated unequivocally that premeditated mutilation could not be excused by past trauma, no matter how severe. The law provided avenues for justice, and Mariana had chosen instead to become a torturer. The sentence was 25 years in Florida State Prison with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. The aggravated battery conviction carried 20 years, the kidnapping added 5, and the probation violation eliminated any chance of concurrent sentencing. At 47 years old, Mariana would be at least 52 before even being considered for release, and more likely would serve the full term, emerging at 68 if she survived that long. Mariana accepted the sentence without visible emotion. She was led from the courtroom in shackles, looking back once at her sobbing mother before disappearing through the door that would close behind her for decades. The Brazilian consulate had already indicated they would not intervene beyond ensuring her basic rights were protected during incarceration. In the months following sentencing, several developments occurred. Thomas and Patricia divorced quietly. She later told a friend she couldn't reconcile the man she thought she married with the stories that emerged during trial. Thomas moved to North Carolina, seeking anonymity and distance from the media attention. He gave one final interview in which he stated that both he and Mariana were tragic figures whose worst impulses had destroyed multiple lives. The case sparked legislative discussions in Florida about protections for domestic violence victims on probation or parole, particularly immigrants whose legal status created additional vulnerability. Mariana's name was invoked in these debates, though the proposals ultimately stalled in committee, deemed too politically controversial to advance. Mariana was transferred to Lowell Correctional Institution, Florida's largest women's prison. Reports from inside indicated she kept to herself, worked in the prison library, and maintained minimal contact with family in Brazil. She reportedly received ongoing letters from domestic violence survivors who saw her as a symbol, however flawed, of resistance against abusers who escape consequences. Detective Foster, now retired, reflected in a later interview that the case represented a complete failure of multiple systems: immigration, domestic violence intervention, probation supervision, and ultimately criminal justice itself. Everyone involved, perpetrator and victim alike, had been failed long before that June evening when rage overwhelmed reason. The story of Mariana Cardoso dos Santos serves as a dark reminder that trauma unaddressed becomes trauma perpetuated, that the cycle of violence continues until someone breaks it or it breaks them, and that justice delayed too often becomes vengeance delivered. 2 lives were irreparably destroyed, families shattered, and a community left to grapple with questions that have no satisfying answers. In the end, there were no winners, only varying degrees of loss measured in years behind bars, permanent scars both physical and psychological, and the haunting knowledge that all of it might have been prevented if anyone had intervened before desperation turned to brutality.